Good evening,
Okay,
Ken.
we had a little glitch there. Somehow my stuff got moved around here, but that's all right. Anyway, welcome everyone. We're here at episode 424 of Line Upon Line. I just want to let everybody know we have surpassed 60,000 views. I didn't even realize that. I just checked this evening, and yeah, we're closing in on 61,000 views. And next month will be our ninth year. So believe it or not, we've been doing this for 9 years. Some of you have been with us since the
It's hard
beginning.
to
So
believe. I was just a kid when this started. I'm still a kid. How did 9 years slip by so fast? Went behind the ears, sort of, kind of. Well, let's do a couple real groaners here to begin with. Did you hear what happened to the snowman when the sun came out? When the sun came out, the snowman had a toe meltdown. How did the barber win the race? How did the barber win the race? He was good at shortcuts. One final short one. This is politics. A citizen says to the politician, I heard a great deal about you to the politician. The politician responded quickly, possibly, but you can't prove any of it. A lot of truth to that, isn't it? You can't prove any of it. Well, today we're in part 2 of a deeper understanding of God's heart and how people can better influence God in their prayers. Because, we sort of pick up where we left off last week. It's clear that Moses saved millions of Israelites by his interceding prayers twice, the golden calf and when they refused to enter the promised land. And by the way, Moses is a type of Christ. You'll see that in the Bible a lot of, and even Moses wrote himself that a great prophet will come in the likeness of Moses, that prophet. And that's quoted in the New Testament, and Christ fulfills that. And by the way, any politician, any cleric says, hey, I am that prophet that Moses predicted. The guy's got the big head. One guy actually said that, and something's wrong with him. That's Jesus Christ who fulfilled that type of Moses. But but Moses, in one sense, was a savior of the people of Israel. And so when they refused to enter the promised land, God was not too happy. And I want us to just notice the logic that Moses used in his intercession with God. It's really interesting. Let's go to Exodus 32:12 and just look at Moses' logic he used.
why should the Egyptians speak and say, he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I have spoken of I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.
I realize that technically descendants could have inherited through Moses, but Moses is still using God's faithfulness and his reputation to intercede. He's not saying, oh, these people are so really good, there's just a few bad ones among them. He didn't say that because I think he knew better. They gave him trouble too. And you remember the spies that came along and they said, oh, the land is a great land, oh, the warriors over there are too tough and the wall's too high, and as if saying, God, who's brought us this far, he couldn't possibly give us a victory. It was total, like, in your face, God. And God took it that way too. Let's go to Numbers 14:10.
And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared to the tabernacle of meeting before him, all the children of Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they.
Well, notice that Moses and Joshua and Caleb, look, we can take it. God is with us. Be faithful. And the people, apparently there was a lot of them in the crowd who supported these leaders. They started throwing stones at Moses. They wanted to get Moses out of the way, take the leadership, and go back to a pagan world. I mean, that's it's kind of hard to believe it. That's pretty much what was going on. God, of course, shone through some lights and power out of the tabernacle and frightened the crowd back. But if not for God, they would have done something terrible. That's how bad they were.
And it's kind of an example for us when we're brought out of the world. Sometimes we struggle with trying to stay out of the world. And the world and Satan is a strong draw.
And I've always asked myself this question. We know they saw the 10 plagues in Egypt, and they saw Pharaoh, who was probably at least the number 2 army in the world, die in the Red Sea, and the Red Sea split when Moses took his little arm and the staff, just like in a movie. They walked through that wall of water, and they saw other miracles too. And they saw God speak from the mountain. How could they have so little faith? I mean, it always amazes me. I'm not saying human nature isn't bad, but they so quickly seem to dissipate. Isn't it amazing?
Well, you see that all the time in people that come to church. They'll get baptized and believe for a little bit, and then the next thing you know, they leave the church, they go off somewhere else because I don't know if God's called them or if they just believe that's where they want to be. But I've never really understood how people can come to the truth and then all of a sudden just walk away from it as quick as they did. I have no affiliation with the Worldwide Church, never have. Didn't even know that much about it, so I don't know what went on there, but other people do, and I've heard it. But it just seems to me people that know God's law can just turn their backs on him that quickly.
That goes back to that parable of the sowing of the seeds. Some fall on the stony ground, some fall into the weeds and thickets or whatever. I forget what he called it, but they grow up around it and choke them out, or some fall into good ground.
It's almost as if it seems as if when you look at the Bible, the Israelites are maybe the most dramatic one because they fell so fast, but it's almost as if miracles and evidence, and there's solid biblical evidence and prophecy and other things about God and the Bible. It's like evidence and miracles don't seem to matter. A lot of people, the evidence hits them in the face and they still don't have any trust.
It's interesting because if you think about it, they were much more comfortable being slaves but secure, and safe but slaves, than they were with being free and working under the liberty of God.
By the way, there's a historian, I've had to look up the names, but several, and they study all these things in socialism and dictatorships and all that. And they say everyone thinks in America that the number one drive for people is freedom. He says, no, the number one drive for most people is security. So if a dictator comes along and says you'll have some level, you may be poor, but you'll have some level of security, they will sell out for security all the time. And what the dictators and the ruling class, the elites want, they don't want democracy, they want power. They're drunk on power. And you see how those two things work together, and you create a lot of bad governments in
It's
all
a
kinds of
global
places.
plague right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Security. The one thing about America, at least theoretically, it was for the least amount of government necessary and the pursuit of happiness. Not that anyone promised it to you, but you could pursue it. But that means you're on your own.
Yep.
And being on your own is not always as easy as it sounds, right?
No, it's not, but it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess we're going to say some about bad trends in the world. I'm going to go into them right now, but it relates to other things. But it does seem like evidence matter to people, including miracles in some cases. Because even during Christ's day, a lot of the religious leaders said, well, we want a bigger sign, another sign. He was doing all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew he could heal anytime he wanted to. They even watched him. If he'd heal when he shouldn't, by their rules, they knew he could do all kinds of miracles, which they couldn't do. And yet they still were jealous. Isn't that amazing? Overpower. So human nature is tricky. But I still think those Israelites really, I think, see a lot of, and here's another issue that we'll look at. If you read a lot of commentaries, they'll say, well, God wasn't really mad at Israel. He was just pretending. He wanted to just test Moses, see what Moses would do. I don't like that answer. I know kids can say anything they want. I don't like that answer because one, if God told Moses, and it's in writing, that he was mad and angry, it's like the Bible is playing games. It's not, you know what I'm saying? And so I really believe that God, they so quickly, less than 40 days, they went to the golden calf. And I think God really was disappointed, shocked with their carnality, stubbornness, whatever it is, stiff necks, as he says, backsliders. God really was angry. I think we need to not play that
Right.
down.
I mean, it's an example for us. I mean, passing through the Red Sea is a sort of baptism. And how long after we were all baptized did it take us to sin? I don't know. I hope the sun might not have set before I had committed a sin that day. But I'd like to think maybe I got past it, but maybe not. So, I don't know. We were all guilty of it, but they seem to be especially... I mean, it's coming out of the world. It's not easy.
We might as well read verse 14. Moses elaborates further on what he said before.
And they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that you, Lord, are among these people, that you, Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands above them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill these people as one man, then the nations which have heard of your fame will speak, saying, because the Lord was not able to bring this people to the land which he swore to give them.
So again, Moses is elaborating. Even the local people in Canaan, they've seen millions of people walk around with this big cloud in the day, and then the cloud of fire behind him at night. Um, so he did that. And one more thing, verse 17, one more piece of logic he used that, this one we might suspect.
And now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, the Lord is long suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clears the guilty.
And he relied on God's patience, his abundance of mercy. If you look at Jonah, remember when Jonah didn't want to go to Israel's rival and enemy, Nineveh, he said, because I know you're full of grace and mercy, and you might forgive these bums. He was a prophet, and he knew what Moses knew, and he's appealing to God's mercy and grace, not to the people's goodness. That always amazed me. Doesn't that always surprise you?
Well, he never said they weren't guilty either. That's the thing. He never said they were not guilty of this. He was just asking God to forgive them. And, which is what we do every day when we wake up. Like Ken was talking about being baptized, you don't know that if you sinned before the sun. I like to think I didn't, but, I've told people many times, there are sins that we don't even know we commit, that we're going to find out, that we won't even know how to repent for them, because there's things that there's no way you can't go without sin. And there's going to be something that creeps into your life. There's things that you do that according to God's law and God's way, I may not even know I'm committing that sin. And somehow, some way, we'll learn it. If not now, we'll learn it in the judgment. And it's what you do with it, and how, like you say, how you respond to God. Is it, Moses, he's been offered world rulership, if you will. He was offered a leadership of a nation to come straight out of him, and he didn't go that route. He wasn't selfish.
And remember, I think we said it last week, God's mind can work real fast at several different levels. So God was sincere in what he said and what he meant. But at another level, he was proud of Moses too.
I believe that.
Moses exhibited godly traits.
Yeah, I believe that.
And that may be another reason why he allowed Moses but it shows he had respect for Moses' thinking. Think about that, a lowly human being, even though Moses was maybe a very special person, even still a mere human being, have that influence with the one who's the power behind the universe.
Right.
And also, Moses, when he got down off the mountain, well, he was angry with them too a little bit, but also they did get justice on the ringleaders. And well, you'll see that when you read the details. So everybody didn't get away with it, at least not all of them. And no one really cheats God. You could argue that instead of them dying in a few days or one day, God did it to at least the responsible parties in 40 years.
Right. He didn't let them become part of the new nation.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Which means
they had to live the rest of their life in the desert. So, maybe they died at 63 instead of 23. But from God's standard, it's still justice. They didn't get to go into the promised land. So it pays to not try to take advantage of God. Then we're going to put anything over on God, little it was. But there's another part of this story that's important. I always think, when I say this part of it, why are our requests important to an almighty God? And then I think of David, maybe 15, 16 years old, guarding the sheep in the pasture at night with his little lyre, their version of a guitar. And he's looking out in the night sky. Of course, they didn't have any light pollution then. And he saw all these stars. And he realized, wow. And you realize that David didn't even know the half of it. Maybe not even a quarter of it. Now they have Hubble telescopes in space and all kinds of stuff. Is it billions of stars? Is that what they now think, if I'm mistaken?
No, billions of galaxies. And there's
Galaxies, that's
trillions
right.
of
And
stars.
galaxies have a ton of stars. Wow. And our Milky Way, is it like 300 light years across, or some unbelievable number? I haven't remembered. These are high, and that's just one galaxy.
Yeah, I lived in the country at one time, and one of my favorite things to do was I don't know, Ken probably gets to do this from time to time too. On a good clear night, turn off every single light, go sit outside without a moon, and just look at the Milky Way. And people may not even know what the Milky Way is and why it was named that way, but if you look at the sky, you see it's vast, and it looks like a stream of milk running through the sky. It's so gorgeous. It's amazing to look at all those
The
stars.
Milky Way is 100,000 light years across.
What? That's
Yeah.
And
even
the
further than I
distance
thought.
between galaxies is billions and billions. I mean, it's just, they're so far apart.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, you wonder why sci-fi came up with all those special drives that you could throw it into special drive, warp drive, and there's some other stuff like that, where you could travel unbelievable distances, warp speed, because the galaxy is so big, we could not travel to the end of it. Well, was it you said 100,000 light years apart, wide? 100,000 light years across. Wow, that take you, well, you and your kids would die many, many times before you ever got there. You'd run out of fuel, water, air, and
It
everything
depends
else.
on how fast you were going.
You could be going warp speed 5.
No,
there
you'd
pretty
still
quick.
be along. According to that, warp is the speed of light. You'd only be going 5 times the speed of light.
Yeah. Right.
But much with it. See, they got sci-fi writers now that have, I won't go into it, where you can instantly appear anywhere in the universe. Well, that's probably what God can do, but my only point is the universe is so big, you can't even conceive of how big it is.
Well, listen, I don't know. I may be a little bit off, but I'm trying to put this in perspective. If you were to think about it, the entire time that known man has been alive, it would take longer than that for us to cross that at any current speed that we know at this time.
They say there could be some stars whose lights we see, they have burned out, but it took so long for the light to get here, it'll be a long time before we realize they're no longer there. Wow.
Right.
You talk about distances. Now, it'd be a tiny little bitty ant on a tiny little anthill climbs to the anthill in the corner of your yard, and he says, "I'm master of the earth." You know, that's what man would be like, saying we're master of outer space. And that would be, the ant would be closer to the truth than we would be. With that in mind, think of David saying, when he sees the greatness of God's universe, what is man that you're mindful of him? Yeah, I'm sure in music and poetry, it's even more beautiful, you know, on a starry night playing David's song. But think about that and the power that God must have, because one star, like our sun, is an unbelievably powerful thing. By the way, there are rumors that the moon, the star, the earth, star, the sun is going to go through some sunspots. They're going to put us into some bad weather cycles. It's just a little burst from our sun will do that to us. Give you some idea. The kind of, and there are I guess, billions and billions of suns out there.
Yes.
So what I did was I went to the scripture in Hebrews 2, where Paul is paraphrasing what David said, and then adds a few more on the question of why is God mindful of us, considering how minute we are compared to God's power. Would you like to read Hebrews 2:6, please, Ken?
All right. But one testified in a certain place, saying, "What is man that you are mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that you take care of him? You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor and set him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjugation under his feet. For in that he put all in subjugation under him. He left nothing that is not put under him. But now we do not yet see all things put under him, for we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone."
And I know the Passover is like 5, maybe a little over, 5 weeks away. That's kind of scary. 5 weeks away. Maybe 5.5 weeks, but not that far away. And we got to realize that Christ died for us, as unimportant as we are, relatively speaking. Because of how great God is. And that means God has given man a level of importance that's a bit surprising. Put all things under us. You could make the argument that man is not only the most dominant species on this planet, but if people wanted to, this is probably not totally true, but man could mess over any species, even whales and sharks, if they really wanted to. I mean, put their mind to it. Not that that would be a good thing to do, get me wrong, but collectively speaking, God has given man he told Adam and Eve to dominate the planet. We are important to God. He's given us this planet. Brother, I'm not a tree hugger. We don't need to worship planets and animals, but it's good to take care of the environment. Reasonable, take care of what God has given us, take care of. There's one more thing. Let's read Hebrews 10:10. That there's a very revealing thing in this one scripture.
"For it was fitting for him, for whom all are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren."
In other words, we are the siblings of Jesus Christ. If you're a true believer and you get converted, isn't that amazing? And it says in the Old Testament, God created the spirit in man. We might argue exactly what is the spirit in man, but there's something in man. I know people act so degraded, it may not seem obvious, but there's something in man that can perceive deep spiritual concepts, philosophical concepts, self-awareness. By the way, they argue that you can make computers do all that, and there's all these computer movies where the computers are the good guys and the organics, meaning real people, are the bad guys, and they're smarter and they have more soul than we do. I don't believe that's possible. Do you think that's possible?
No, the human mind, we are not even scratching how we could possibly someday, recreate the human mind to give something the ability to think and reason and have its own self-being, soul, of what have you. We'll never get there.
Yeah, I remember when people talk about programming, they say, well, you can give a computer 12 options, all of which are reasonable at a certain problem. Then it goes circular through the options and mess around with it, finds the best one. And I guess that is a form of thinking, but it's still not quite the same thing as deep self-awareness thinking.
No, it doesn't have conscience. It doesn't have love. It doesn't have the human emotions. That's one of the appeals of Star Trek was Spock never had the human emotions. Well, he did sometimes because he was half human, but the Vulcans had no human emotions. And so when you watch that show, you know, when I do from time to time, and I don't watch it often, but I think of that point that, you know, the human emotions that we have, all the human emotions, those don't come from man or being made by a robot or anything to that nature. That comes from God. And the hate comes from, you know, there's an evil emotion as well that we all have in us. You know, that is true of that. So God is purging us of those evil emotions as well. And he's helping us to understand that there's an evil out there because God knows everything. And people, you know, need to realize that Satan was with God at one point in time. So you got to think about that when you think about some of the things you see on these programs, like you were talking about the robots. Is that really something that man came up with, or is that in the influence, or were they influenced by a demon to make that particular show? I've seen several of them like that.
Yeah, they're kind of making light of the greatness of man. I'm not
Right.
saying there aren't cute robots. I mean, you can do clever things like vacuum your floors and run warehouses and, you know, and shuttle the broken stuff down a chute that it's supposed to. I mean, really good programming and you know, moving stuff to the right port and bay. Great programming that can be made by human beings. How clever people are, but it's not the same thing as the deep philosophical soul feeling that God put in every human being. It's like we are the seed of God. Now, whether
Yeah.
that seed, like you were saying, Ken, about the good soil, whether the seed, and we'll all get a chance to take root, grows and develops or becomes bad, I guess depends on us ultimately. But that's why we're important to God. And it's good to remember that when we think about prayer. Um, Remember, David was a man after God's own heart. Let's talk about David for a minute. I didn't put a whole lot of scriptures about David in because there's so much ink in the Bible about David. You'd end up with 3 or 4 or 5, 6 papers all about David. Actually, we probably know more about David than any man in the Bible, I think, more than even Moses, quite a few of the prophets. I can't actually think of anybody who gets more ink in the Bible than David. Can you?
No.
And you know, it says David was the apple of God's eye, and obviously that's true. Let's just look at Samuel 2:7-3.
And then Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you."
Now, the context of that is David's now an established king, and God's given him victory and successes and all kinds of good things. And the prophet Nathan has been told by God, you know, anything that David wants to do, I'm blessing him. I've got David's back. I support everything David wants to do. And so Nathan, naturally, when David said, well, you know, I live in this cedar palace, and God's in this little tent over here. I mean, well, at least the Ark of the Covenant, supposedly God's throne seat. In this little tent over here, I want to build him a magnificent temple, one of the greatest in the world. Well, God answers Nathan and says, "Tell David, I don't need a house. Have I ever asked for a house? You know, the mountains are my footstools. You know, I live in the I don't really need it. But I like you, David, so much, I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to build you a dynasty. We actually still believe, at least our church does, that the throne in England is still David's throne. But whether that's true or not, we can debate that, but probably it's true. But Jesus Christ will inherit that throne. It'll be the throne that will last forever and ever. Now, you think about what David did. David's prayer changed a lot of the Bible, because all those things in the Bible about the temple and the course of the priest to serve the temple, and they had like a choir of 3,000 singers and 3,000 musicians. There's all kinds of stuff in the Bible about the temple. Even the trigger for the end time is the abomination, desolation of the temple. None of that would have existed if it weren't for David's prayers. God altered history because of what David prayed. And that's kind of amazing when you think about it, but it's true. Now, God didn't want David to build it because he was a man of war. Although before we criticize David, that was the role he was put in. So, and he succeeded in it. But God wanted the temple to be a land of prayer and peace. But David got the plans from God. He got all the silver and gold, and his son was given the wisdom and the craftsmen to build it. That's how much God loved David. Isn't that amazing? And a lot of, I'd say at least half the book of Psalms are prayers from David and his many adventures when he was in harm's way and when he was celebrating. But it's all in there. David's prayer set to music and poetry. David had a big impact on everything. And Jesus Christ came in the lineage of David. I think actually in two ways. Joseph was in his legal lineage and Mary was in his genetic lineage. I mean, for those who care about such things. But David is in, the Messiah came in David's lineage. That's how important he was to God. And I just think that's a great thing to think about. Now, always when I think about David, I say to myself, we realize that none of us can say we're a David or we're a Moses or we're an Elijah, right? It has that kind of relationship with God, not even close. But it's in the Bible for a reason, right?
Yep.
And if somebody were to ask you, Ken, why do you think it's in the Bible, all that coverage of David, a man after God's own heart?
Probably to give us an example of what we need to be like.
And I actually want to throw a knuckleball in. Even though there are two big sins of David mentioned, Bathsheba and the time he took a census, meaning he was trusting more military numbers than God. In spite of those two things, he was still a man after God's own heart. And so I think you could take from that, you might say, well, I'm not a super righteous person. God can't really listen to me. But that's not necessarily true, is it? I'm not encouraging anybody to be bad. You all know I know better than that. All I'm saying is you don't have to be perfect, have a loving relationship with God. I mean, David, when he was singing praise to God, David really loved God. He felt a love for God. And we should try for that energetic, emotional love for God. And I know it's hard to do because we're not getting all those spectacular miracles and he's way up in heaven, we're way down here. But we do have two things that most people don't have. We have the Bible and we have
Yeah.
God's Holy Spirit. And I hope to meet David someday. And that's what a lot of people are going to probably ask you, well, why did you write this psalm that way and that psalm the other way?
Well, we're all going to want to hear them as they actually were intended.
Exactly.
In the language,
Exactly. You're
in
going
the
to want to hear
language
it
they
the way
were
it was written.
And you're like, poetry has a certain meter to it, rhyme and meter that we
also
don't
as
get in
close
English.
to David was to God, God is love. I mean, you would think that would rub off and inspire David even the more.
Yes. And, actually, David made another mistake too. Now, maybe it's all related, but David was loving on his kids, at least two of them. He may have been too indulgent in his love of them, and they got spoiled. I know that because my child was complaining to me about giving too much stuff to my granddaughter, saying, "You're spoiling them." When I was their age, I didn't. Anyway,
Oh, we all went through that.
I don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
But you understand, part of it, I said, well, I didn't have the money to buy a lot of gifts for you when you were that age. But I probably, I could have maybe showered more gifts on him, but
it would have
might
just
have just
it
spoiled
wouldn't
him
it
worse.
wouldn't have
So
been
who's
good.
to say?
Right.
Yeah, he's complaining. So you know what I'm saying. Sometimes you can be too loving to your kids and not even know it.
Definitely.
Yeah. So being human, we have a lot of pitfalls we can fall into. Let's go to 1 Kings 17:21.
And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, O Lord, my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him. Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived.
And there are only, I believe, 7 examples of people being brought back from the dead. It's very, very rare. So it's quite a miracle. And, people will say, well, God just planned it. He had planned to do it all along. Again, it's that same old thing. I don't know if that's really true. Maybe, by the way, do you know in the ancient days, young children died at a much higher rate than they do now? I can't remember the stats, but they have good stats for the Roman Empire. If a child could live like to 8 or 9 or 10 years old, they're probably going to make it. But a lot of little kids, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, died of various kinds of, they just didn't have the antibodies and stuff we have now. You could argue about, depends on the society they were. Some places have bad nutrition, some not so bad, but a child dying is not that uncommon. And it could be that because of the circumstances, when Elijah cried, that word cried is in there, cried out, he changed God's mind. He says, well, I was going to let this kid die the natural death. I don't think God was out to get anybody. It was just natural death. He changed his mind and brought that boy back to life. And when you read scriptures, this happened 2 more times. His successor, Elisha, did the same thing with another boy who died of heat stroke out in the field. We don't know the details, not a lot, but he probably was like 5 or 6 or 7, that vulnerable age, got heat stroke, died, and Elijah cried out to God and brought him back to life. And then the apostle Paul probably blamed himself. He had a going away party. They thought they'd never see him, and probably started at around 6 o'clock, ate dinner, and then Paul spoke to midnight. And a young man, probably 10 or 11 or 12, was on the rafters up real high, and Paul probably bored him to sleep, and he fell and killed himself or died from a crash. And Paul pleaded with God, and God brought him back to life. Yay. That shows you the power of prayer, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It does. Well, we have prayer lists in all our groups. We prayed for people many times. I've heard you guys pray for people in our group, and you can see if, when you really open your eyes to look at it, you can see the power of prayer. You can watch, and I've seen time and time again people be really sick. Some people are on their deathbed, and they get these prayers from collective group, and including your own self. These people all of a sudden turn for the better. Not always, but it happens. It happens a lot. It happens a lot, and so I think David saw that quite a bit. I think he saw a lot of his prayers were answered right in front of his face, and so how could he ever refuse God? How could he ever not believe in God when he's praying to his Father? And then a lot of these. I mean, think about the wars he fought, and he just relied on the Father to protect him and to help him through these wars.
Oh, let me give you one example. Saul had a big army, and David, by some spies, they knew that David was hiding in this little hillside in some caves, and they completely surrounded it. No way David could get out. And David prayed to be rescued. And at that moment, a messenger came to Saul, said the Philistines are invading, whatever they were invading, and Saul and his army had to immediately leave. That guy had been an hour or two later, they would have captured and they would have killed David. Now, some people speculate if Saul knew with 100% certainty that David was hiding in there, he probably wouldn't have cared about what the Philistines are going to do to his country. By let's get David. I'm more jealous of him. But he didn't know for sure. Now, you can say that's coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences. He answered God's prayer in a way that you wouldn't expect.
Right.
And David spent 7 years, I think, on the run from Saul. And Saul thought he had him, but somehow God always got him out of danger, somehow. And probably taught David some lessons and his men that put him in good stead when he did become king. Sometimes hard times make people stronger than if it was easy. Also, I heard this on the radio. I'm assuming it's true. The Cleveland Clinic did some kind of study that a whole bunch of people, some that they knew people were praying for, and others that nobody was praying for or didn't believe in God. And they followed up to see if they could see any difference. They did not expect to see a significant statistical difference. And guess what? The prayed for group did much better than the non-prayed for group. Now, I hope I didn't get any of those details wrong. I didn't write it down, but I think it was Cleveland Clinic. It might have been some other place. Have you heard anything like that, Ken?
I've heard that. I heard that report, and it set me to believing that there's many things that science loves to tell you they know about that they have no clue about, and this is just one of them.
Yeah. And it might not have been the Cleveland Clinic, it might have been another hospital system, but somewhere. And I thought, well, you just never really know. They even come up with some studies on COVID vaccines and improving both the mask and the vaccine on the new variants make no difference at all. And nobody seems to know that. The media has not released any of that information. And the CDC doesn't want to release any stats because it might mislead people. Oh, well, you can imagine what that means. But maybe you can't find the evidence there, but we are important to God, as insignificant as we are. And that kind of is an amazing thing, isn't it?
It is.
And as bad as people are, too. But God will straighten us out in the great white throne and maybe in this world to some extent, too. So this brings us to the third point. What is the Eternal's goal or purpose for believers? And what is God after? And I think we need to think about this when we think about prayer. And Ken, can you look at Ephesians 4:12?
For training of the saints as servants in the church, for the building up of the body of Christ, till we all come to the harmony of harmony of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to full growth, to the full measure of Christ.
In other words, God has us working toward maturity. I would argue that one factor in working toward maturity is talking with God, with feeling. Not somebody told me this in church, not just rote repetition, but even if you're praying for similar things, similar people, you can still pray for them, but in individual, unique ways. You have to use the exact same words every time. And kind of like a real chat to somebody that you love. I mean, you have to respect God's power and awesomeness, of course, but still talking with our emotion and our heart uniquely is part of what will help us to grow spiritually. By the way, we're going to have part 3. I know you're saying, part 3. Yes, there's more we could say, part 3. And it's going to take off kind of where we're going to leave off now. Let's look at Ephesians 4:22, please, Ken.
Put off your old nature, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and put on the new nature, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness.
That's God's goal for us. That is a great goal. He wants us to be more like Jesus. It's almost kind of scary when you hear that, isn't it? Because you realize how untrue that is, right?
Right. Yeah, it's hard to drive home sometimes, or to even fathom the greatness that you're being promised in the Bible. That's, I think, in one way, in one aspect, that may be one of the reasons why people don't see the truth of God as it really is written sometimes, because their minds can't comprehend the greatness that you're going to see, that Christ is, when we're living and reigning with Christ and ruling in his, and being the Spirit, being, I'm sure I won't be able to fly right away. If I do, I might have to learn, but that's why the angels will be looking at us like these bumbling idiots, I think. But to think of can you even think about this world being a glorious, beautiful world with no pollution, probably no gas, no cars, no TV, nothing like that, no news, everything's always good. It's hard to fathom that.
No news. I want to fly.
Yeah, I do too, but I want to be able to land safely and be able to survive that landing.
Yeah. like when you were a kid, you always want to put a towel on the back of your neck and be Superman, right?
Right.
That kind of thing. Well, who knows what our flying skills will be like? It will be interesting. And maybe we'll be able to do our version of warp speed. I mean, like 100 warp speed, go to the end of the Milky Way, just like that. But it is a bit scary. One thing that occurred to me, and I know this is self-promoting, but we'll say it anyway. People like David, and especially Moses, knew God very well. And I'm sure Elijah, Elisha, and Paul did. And that's one reason they were so effective in prayer. The more we learn God's word, the more effective we should be. Because we'll understand God more. Therefore, you got nothing else to do on Friday night, watch line upon line, right?
Yes.
Any thoughts?
Absolutely, it's absolutely a great way to start your Sabbath off.
That's right. And even if we pose questions, and you don't have to agree 100% on everything, just think about it. And and of course, you can read all around the scriptures. We may just pick one out of the area. We don't give all the context, but thinking about the Bible is a good thing.
Yep.
A good thing. And let's go to Ephesians 5:10.
And learn in your own experiences what is fully pleasing to the Lord.
So in our life, we kind of bounce around back and forth, but kind of learn what we think God is blessing and what he's not blessing. Kind of learn how to please God. And that is a great thing. Well, we were discussing a little bit of prophecy and world politics before the show. Obviously, these are just our opinions. We could be wrong as well. Assume for a minute that Satan has a lot of influence over this world. God has allowed it. We might argue about how much God is restraining Satan, but he's got a lot of influence. Therefore, if the media pushes one narrative too much, I get suspicious. I get real suspicious. I'm starting to ask myself, some of the people we see on the media and social media, I mean, they're very good at it, don't get me wrong. They're pushing propaganda to push America into war. Have I shocked you all?
Not at all.
That's my Big Ben.
No, they are. They're trying to. I mean, some people are saying some pretty ignorant things without fully knowing or partially knowing what the situation is. There are no good guys except the people on the ground, the citizens. They have done nothing wrong, really. The citizens of both countries live in a completely corrupt government. Under completely corrupt governments. Both leaders are corrupt, and Ukraine is actually way at the top of the list of most corrupt governments on the planet, along with Russia. But this way the world is jumping in both feet on one side and pushing us to do things that would not necessarily be smart. You got to know the history of these two countries, and you got to know why we are where we are today.
Now, I can understand the regular Ukrainian people. Of course, I'm giving my opinion. They, of course, were part of the Soviet Union, and on or off, they were part of the Russian Empire for many centuries, and what all that you can read the history of it. And land moved back and forth as they made deals after World War II and after World War I. But anyway, the main thing is, like Crimea was back and forth, but the main thing is, I think they're attracted to the prosperity and relative freedom of the West compared to the dark dankness of the East, including the former Russia, Soviet Union. And the average Joe, they're thinking, do I really want to become part of Russia or Russian influence too much? No, I want the good times of the West. And I think that actually scares the Russians too, or these certain Russian leaders. They want, well, obviously they don't want NATO on their border, which Putin has talked about that. And I think they claim he got some promises way back in the 1990s or somewhere that we weren't going to put NATO on his border, but those things have changed. And maybe Putin wasn't in power so much then, but now he is. And anyway, obviously Putin is wrong to solve the problem the way he is. Plus, trying to put together the Russian Empire is maybe a bad ambition. So he's wrong in that way. But America does not need to go to war. This is not America's fight. But the bigger thing is, if you compare this to World War I, it started in the same part of the world because Serbia was very close to Ukraine, Eastern European squabble over stuff. And the whole world thought it was above going to a world war. But because of alliances and bad actions and people getting all stirred up by the press that existed in 1914, they went from, we're just going to punish the people in that Eastern European country, Serbia, and the terrorist group, to the whole world going into a horrible war. A war that actually, the world learned its first multi-million genocide, poison gas, bombing, carpet bombing of cities with poison gas, horrible trench warfare, rats. I could go on about the horrible things of World War I. And you could even argue World War II is like round two of World War I. All over some Eastern European squabble. We don't want to commit that same mistake. I'm not saying that the world would do anything as bad as World War I, but they didn't think it would happen in 1914 either.
No.
They said they were too educated and too smart. Would you believe that? That's what they said.
Yeah, the stakes are way too high now for us to have this World War III. The stakes are way too high. All it takes is one rogue person to get a hold of or shoot a nuclear off, and then you got a chain reaction that we don't want to see. There's so much that could happen out of this, and like Ken said, we got some people calling for some things that they're not thinking this through very clearly, because we do not want to get in that situation over something that it's exactly right that Ukraine was a part of Russia for the most part, and they're just we were talking a little bit earlier how you were saying, Ken, I think he was talking about, he wasn't even going to go past Kiev, I guess, or maybe get Kiev, but then they was going to stop and kind of keep that little border there, but he was just going to reclaim what they had before. And now, you've almost pushed Russia in a corner. And if we keep going, that's what they're going to do. And when you do that, that wounded animal is going to fight back. So we need to be very clear and very, very conscious about what we're doing here. And I hope there's cooler heads that prevail and not necessarily the leadership that we're looking at today.
And most of this is being driven by worldwide Western media. And the decisions are being made in Western Europe, not in Washington, D.C. Right. Germany, originally we didn't want too many tough sanctions, but 500,000 Germans came out, demonstrated for Ukraine. The German government flipped. That now, except for oil, much harsher sanctions. And even Switzerland, which has remained neutral for 200 years, whatever it is, even Switzerland for the first time is in on much of the banking and other sanctions, which the Swiss never do that. This is going to really, I don't know what's going to happen. I know that if America tries to put an air blockade on Ukraine, now we did it in Libya fairly easy. That's a second-class military. We did it in Iraq, second-class military. I'm not saying American jets aren't better than Russian jets, but believe me, doing it in Ukraine
none
is
of those other
risky.
countries that we ever put an air no-fly zone over had nukes. Russia has 1,000 nukes pointed at the United States.
Yeah.
They have more nukes than any country in the world. Not that you need more, but they got twice as many as we have.
I heard there was 14,000 nuclear weapons or nuclear arms all across the world right now. 14,000.
That'll do it. That'll pretty much do it.
That'll do it.
I don't think that it'll go that far. But there are even some people, I'm just saying what I've heard on the internet, I know you can't believe it, who speculate that some in our government want a limited war because any kind of crisis they can use to suppress freedoms. Normally, I wouldn't believe anything like that, but looking at how they handled COVID, I can believe it. Not that they caused it, but they will use it and maybe even try to make it worse up to a point. But see, that's like playing with fire. We'll just turn up the heat a little bit so we can make more money from the industrial military complex. And, and mostly, I mean this respectfully, the country boys will do the fighting and dying, and we elites. But it may not be able to control it. Once you start a fire, you make it bigger, it's gonna make it out of control.
You got it, but I don't know. I kind of see how this I think is playing out, and the big thing I'm kind of concerned with is what China may do soon over Taiwan.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, Ken. China is still Russia's ally, though they backed off being as supportive as they were before because they don't want the economic sanctions. But no one said anything about China in this, though they're supporting Russia. What would you get out of what's gone on in Eastern Europe? What would you get out of this whole thing if you were China studying?
Well, right now they're getting Putin's oil, and they've let Russia see. You've heard about that SWIFT banking system that I guess we limited Russians access to or something. That did absolutely nothing because China developed years ago their own version of a SWIFT global currency account. I think it's not based on the dollar. But Russia's still getting access to funds and they still moving things around. It's just going to make Russia more inclined to what China gets is just a bigger, a more secure ally in Russia. I mean, with Putin, because one time when they met Xi and Putin, and evidently they hit it off like great buddies, and they evidently they mentioned how they think alike and how they are have similar mindsets on global events and things. So, to have someone the size of Russia on China's side, and I don't know if Russia still has more advanced military tech than China. They used to, but still, it could all be, those two powers sitting right next to each other, having a union, of sorts against Europe.
Yeah, and India's starting to swing their way as well, so don't forget that in this whole deal.
Yeah, and when Trump was president, he was pulling India away. And see, one thing that used to be America's successful foreign policy was driving a wedge between China and Russia. If you think about it logically, that's in
Right.
America's best interest. But the more we dump on the Russians, like the whole Russia false collusion, you're just driving Russia into the arms of China tighter, and that's not good geopolitically. But I don't know if there's anything we can do at this point. The media, my military opinion, if I were China and I looked at what happened in Ukraine, I said, well, I want that to happen to us. If they choose to take Taiwan this year, they may wait because Ukraine did not go well. But if they choose to go, I would go with overwhelming force to win it so quick that it's a fait accompli and the world doesn't have much time to cry over it or send them aid or cut off things to China. In other words, you send so many planes, soldiers, boats that you overwhelm Taiwan in 3 days and it's over. Now, if I were China militarily, now maybe they don't think that way, but if the war gets drawn out like Ukraine, obviously, and a lot of Chinese are on social media complaining about the red Chinese, there could be a lot of sanctions on China.
The funny part is, or the ironic part is the reason it's going so slow in Ukraine is because of China. Putin wanted to go in. Putin wanted to go in a few weeks ago, but Xi made him promise not to go in because of the Olympics. He didn't want this stuff to happen. Now
Oh,
that, and because Putin wanted to go in when the ground was more frozen, it was colder. It's getting harder for him to move vehicles around and all the mud in Ukraine that he would have avoided 3-4 weeks ago.
Oh, that's right. I remember the Germans had that same problem. Anyway, and the Russians are good at fighting and using tanks in the winter. It's hard to think of fighting in the winter, but the Russians, that won them the war. They had 2 winter offensives against the Nazis. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, frozen ground, if you're moving fast, is better than mud and gook. Yeah, I never thought about that. Wait until the Olympics are over. Yeah. And with their troops in position, so the Ukrainians had time to see where they are. I'm sure Americans and other countries were telling them satellite images if they didn't already know. Yeah, I do see that problem. And how many days after the Olympics?
No, it was like 1,
like
2.
4 or 5 days later, right?
Next day.
Yeah,
They'd have
it
time
wasn't but a
to
day or two.
all
Yeah.
the trophies and the invasion was
Yep.
on.
Everybody that kept saying he was going to go in before the end of the Olympics, I kept saying, no, he isn't. No, he isn't.
No.
Throwing a
That's
rain on
right.
Xi's parade. Oh, well, all I'm saying is it looks like the world is united and the media is beating one drum. We should be suspicious. And what may come out of this is soft fascism, where the media and all the industries pounce on whoever the target is. Now the target is Russia, but at some point in the future, it could be somebody else or some other country who doesn't fall in line. And this kind of mentality, whenever the beast is ready to put his super government together, this is the perfect backdrop, isn't
I
it?
just want to know if Antifa is loading up and heading for Ukraine so they can fight fascism.
By the way, fascists, Mussolini, the inventor of fascism, had black robe, costumed hitmen by the thousands that attacked his political enemies, beat up businessmen, and our anti-fascists act just like the real fascists and dress like them. So our left-wing party has their own fascist troops.
They just replaced the KKK with Antifa and BLM.
Yep.
And Antifa might be meaner and younger. Maybe not meaner. Maybe you could argue that. Well, at any rate, we're going to do part 3 of this. There's one more really good thing that we can focus on next week. And I just hope all of you who stuck it out this long to hear our speculation come back next week. And one more thing that Ken said. What did you say about handing out bullets to everybody in Ukraine? That you didn't think that was
somebody was
a good
interviewed
idea?
I forget who interviewed him. I don't know, it was an ex-general or someone from the State Department. They said that Putin wanted a buffer between NATO and Russia, and what he wanted was the Russian portion that used to be part of Russia in Ukraine. He wanted it back to add as a buffer. He has no plans on taking all of Ukraine, and he has no plans to go into Poland or Romania. This is him speaking. And he said the only thing we're doing by sending ammunition and weapons to Ukraine is getting more Ukrainians killed and prolonging this whole mess. Because the Ukrainian army cannot beat the Russian army, and they're going to win regardless. The only thing that we're doing is getting people killed. That's what he said.
One thing about guerrilla warfare is, let's say if a bunch of civilians out of apartment windows, when the Russian troops go by, they shoot a bunch of them. Okay, well, that hurts the Russians, but what will the Russian response be? Well, you think about it, if soldiers are being shot by civilians, then soldiers will have to consider civilians as potentially dangerous, and won't more civilians be gunned down by Russian soldiers than being gunned down now? And I know they say, well, the Russians are letting people leave who want to leave. That's true. So they can assume that anybody who stays wants to fight. But I don't know if you really see, people think that all these people with guns will just chase the Russians out and win a great victory. Well, it'll hurt the Russians and it might eventually win a victory, but it could cost thousands of lives. The quicker the war ends, the better.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
A quick ceasefire and a quick political solution is the best answer you can get, and less chance of the war getting
Right.
deeper.
And remember,
worse.
there's no good guys in this.
The more you drag out the war, the more you drag out the war, the more people will die. Russians will die, but so will probably even more Ukrainians.
And my final note is, that next week we're going to have one of our leaders going over there that can make all this happen.
Yeah. Talking about giggles.
Yeah.
She's going to
Just
solve
so
the problem, right?
Just solve everything. She's gonna
Yeah.
solve it all.
It's like when I look at Buttigieg and I say Secretary of Transportation, I just laugh. I might have a bad attitude or what?
Before we sign off, I want to mention a couple of things. Everyone, please keep Loma in your prayers. She seems to be kind of winding down. She's staying with her daughter. She's fortunate that she has a daughter that takes care of her and loves her and is making this comfortable for her as she can. And another thing is Mrs. Gooch is doing much better, and she had some surgery, and they're going to be taking out the stitches soon, so her eyesight, I guess, is improving, and things seems to be getting better for her. So another example of the power of prayer.
Go.
Yep. So everyone, I
Thank you,
hope
Ken.
you have a wonderful Sabbath, and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
We're happy you could make it, and so glad you are here, and hope that we've been able to make God's word more clear. Until next time, may God be with you in everything you try. But for now, till next week, we have to say goodbye.